What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a discussion-oriented video around what is next for Larian Studios. And while I certainly don't work there or have any concrete answers, lucky for us, Larian Studios themselves has given several interviews over the last couple of weeks where we can get a pretty good idea of this directly from the studio itself. But I mostly wanted to talk about this because a lot of people have been asking me if I thought Baldur's Gate 3 would get an expansion or anything like that, and even in that regard, we have some information from the studio. So while a little bit of this will certainly be my own speculation, a lot of it does have a source to go along with it, and those sources will be in the description below if you'd like to read some of them for yourself. Now, I figured it would be fun to start with the near term and then talk about what is farther out in terms of a next release. In the more immediate future, Larian's CEO, Swin, is already on the record stating that they are busy working on things like hotfixes and patches for Baldur's Gate 3. The first one is said to have about 1,000 fixes for it already. And then after that, they'll start taking into account some community suggestions for things like quality of life features, etc. Now, that's no real surprise. That's just kind of standard development at this point. But when it comes to any extra content for BG3, I think the conversation gets a little bit murkier because Larian Studios has also stated that any expansion or increase to the character level would be very hard to implement for a variety of reasons, not the least of which that the spells and abilities you get at those levels are very difficult to translate to a video game, which is honestly pretty true. It's also been stated that they are not currently working on any sort of expansion, so given the hesitance that they've expressed alongside the fact that, the work isn't being done, I'm not inclined to personally think that there will be an expansion. It's also not really their MO as a studio. That's not something they've done a ton of. What is much more common for them is to patch, polish, and then add some extra content on the smaller scale, which is what we've seen them do with previous titles, which usually culminates in a definitive edition. So while I certainly wouldn't say it's impossible to see an expansion, I'm inclined to think it's probably going to be more the definitive edition route with all the fixes and patches attached. Now, honestly, what is much more interesting to me as a subject is what Larian Studios is doing for its next title, which seems to be somewhat in flux at the studios themselves, with it being stated in interviews that while they are working on a few ideas too early to announce, for the most part, they're trying to let some of the teams take a bit of a break following the launch of BG3 while they work out what they want to do next. And while it's easy to assume things like another sort of D&D game or a new adventure of some sort, it's also important to remember that Larian Studios is known for its own IP, the Divinity universe, which they've also stated in interviews here that they very much so plan on getting back to at some point, which is admittedly a little vague. And on that note, while they originally had a title on hold called Divinity Fallen Heroes, it was announced that that particular game was officially canceled, which is not a huge surprise, to be honest with you. Given the age of that project, it has been several years ago that was initially put on hold. So when it comes to them creating a potential new Divinity game, it would very much so likely be a very different story that could potentially carry on that timeline. And I'll spare everybody the lore nerd stuff, but I'm really into the Divinity universe, and that idea is much more interesting to me than just about anything else Larian could do. So given all these statements directly from the studio, though, I think it's safe to say that in the near future, we can expect the obvious hotfixes, patches, getting Baldur's Gate 3 even more polished up, especially the later acts of the game, which are a little bit rough by comparison to the initial parts that were in early access, though realistically, for anyone who doesn't play these kinds of games regularly, compared to their previous release, the last act of this game is in a much better playable state. The last act of Divinity Original Sin 2 was borderline unplayable before the definitive edition, and while you can certainly run into bugs and things in Baldur's Gate 3's last act, it's not nearly as bad. That said, though, obviously they're still fixing and adding things, but when it comes to talking about the future, it is much more open, and from the sounds of all these interviews, it doesn't even sound like Larian themselves knows for sure exactly what they'll be doing next. We know they haven't started work on an expansion. It's likely, from the sounds of this, that they're prototyping, or at least working on some ideas for their next project. which, truth be told, simply from the, I would say, massive and unexpected, even for Larian, success of Baldur's Gate 3, even those plans might change. This might alter their trajectory a little bit. But I can say that for me personally, I sincerely hope they make another Divinity title, preferably one that carries on the story of the farthest game in the timeline, Divinity 2, which takes place about 60 years after Divinity Original Sin 2, which is a different game. In any event, though, I think many people will be up to try just about anything that they put together after the success of this particular title, and it will certainly be interesting to see where they go from here. But that's pretty much going to do it for this video. No concrete answers by any means, but certainly a fun conversation to have. And while I don't think it will be soon by any means, nor do I think it should be, if anything, I think they deserve a bit of a rest after the work on this one before jumping into a fresh project. However, I am looking forward to finding out what they're doing for myself. So that's going to do it for today's video. Certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know what you'd like to see Larian work on in the comments below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.